Excellences,
Excellencies, dear Professor Beard, dear President and members of the Latsis Foundation, dear laureates, dear colleagues from the Swiss higher education institutions and international higher education institutions, dear colleagues from the University of Geneva, dear guests, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is a tremendous honor to open this ceremony this evening. To start with, on behalf of the 4 institutions here tonight, namely the University of St. Gallen, the École Polytechnique Fédérale of Lausanne, the École Polytechnique Fédérale of Zurich, and the University of Geneva, I would like to thank the Latsis Foundation, which promotes younger students in our institutions through the Latsis University Prizes. These Latsis Prizes distinguish young researchers for their scientific contribution and technological contribution. We cannot highlight sufficiently how important these prizes are to make young talents visible. The Latsis Foundation also offers the opportunity to the University of Geneva, the opportunity to welcome each and every year renowned speakers who share their experience with us. This will be the case this evening, since we will have the opportunity to listen to Mary Beld, professor of ancient literature at the University of Cambridge, who will talk about power under the Roman world. And with no further ado, I now give the floor to the president of the Latsis Foundation, Yves Fruquiger.
Les salutations protocolaires ayant été assurées brillamment par
Since the Vice Rector has already observed all protocols, I will only say, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear laureates, it is a great pleasure for me to bid you welcome this evening for the 2025 Latsis University Prizes Awards ceremony, which, as every year, is being held at the University of Geneva. Allow me first to thank from the bottom of my heart Professor Martine Collard, the University of Geneva's Vice Rector, as well as Ms. Sophie Hulot, for their long-standing commitment and engagement towards the organization of this event, which has over the years become a highlight of Swiss academic life. I also would like to extend a warm welcome to the representatives of our partner institutions, Professor Stéphanie Lacour for EPFL, Professor Uwe Zawal for ETHZ, as well as Professor Klaus Müller for the University of St. Gallen. It is a great honor to have you with us tonight. The close collaboration of these institutes of higher education with the Latsis Foundation has, for many years now, contributed to the outreach and success of these prizes. The Latsis Foundation awards this year, for the 43rd time, these university prizes. About 150, 170 laureates have been honored since the beginning of these prizes. As Ms. Martine Collard has said, these prizes are meant to acknowledge and encourage young and promising researchers from the 4 partner institutions. Over the decades, many prize winners have gone on to have exceptional academic careers and have thereby contributed to the prestige of research in Switzerland. This is my only wish for the 4 winners of this year's prizes. I would also like to thank the research commissions of the partner institutions for the invaluable work done in selecting these exceptional laureates. Year after year, the Latsis Foundation, I'd like to thank the Latsis family at this juncture for its efforts to promote young generations of research and highlight academic excellence in Switzerland. Next week, it will continue fulfilling this mission by awarding, at the same time as the Marcel Benoit Prize, the Latsis Swiss Science Prize worth 100,000 Swiss francs during a ceremony that will be taking place in the Federal Palace in Bern. This event will give us another opportunity to highlight the dynamism and quality of Swiss science. Finally, it is a true privilege to welcome this evening's speaker, Professor Mary Bird, Emeritus Professor in Ancient Literature at the University of Cambridge. I would like to thank her warm-heartedly for having accepted our invitation by giving us the honor of being present and giving a keynote. I wish you all a wonderful ceremony and an inspiring conference, which will be followed by a Q&A. With no further ado, it is a privilege for me to introduce you to the first laureate of our 4 Latsis Prizes, nominated by the University of Geneva, Dr. Quentin Béran, for his thesis towards dissolving circumscribed space in Frank Lloyd Wright's work, the example of his studio houses. Now you'll have the opportunity to discover his work.
La particularité de ma recherche réside dans le fait qu'elle n'appréhende pas seulement l'architecture comme un objet d'art, mais comme une construction qui regroupe des réflexions liées à la psychologie, à la philosophie et à la sociologie. Elle place l'être humain et surtout son ressenti au cœur de ses préoccupations.
Et si nos maisons pouvaient changer notre humeur, nos relations et notre bien-être? C'est la question au cœur de la recherche de Quentin Béran, historien de l'art à l'Université de Genève. Nous passons la majorité de notre temps dans des lieux construits. Mais ces espaces, souvent pensés pour être pratiques, oublient parfois l'essentiel: notre épanouissement. Dans ses recherches, Quentin Béran s'est intéressé aux outils mis en place par un architecte en particulier pour créer des espaces agréables et propices au bien-être de ses habitants. Frank Lloyd Wright. À la fin du XIXe siècle, ce dernier bouleverse les conventions de l'architecture d'alors en détruisant la boîte traditionnelle de l'habitat, faite de pièces fermées et isolées. Son idée ? Créer des volumes ouverts, lumineux et fluides. Des espaces qui encouragent les échanges tout en préservant l'intimité. Pour comprendre cette vision, Quentin Béran a étudié les 3 maisons-ateliers de l'architecte, Oak Park, Taliesin et Taliesin West, les seuls lieux que Wright a construits pour lui-même, de véritables laboratoires théoriques et pratiques dans lesquels il vivait, travaillait et expérimentait.
Dans l'imaginaire collectif, les maisons de Frank Lloyd Wright forment des espaces dans lesquels nous nous sentons bien. Et l'objectif de ma recherche est de comprendre les outils qui ont été développés par l'architecte et qui aboutissent au fait que les retombées sensibles sur les habitants sont jugées positives. Et une fois que ces outils sont définis, la finalité de mon étude est d'analyser et de déterminer les dispositifs spatiaux qui aboutissent à notre épanouissement au sein d'un espace donné.
Pour analyser les outils mis en place par l'architecte pour créer des espaces propices à l'épanouissement de leurs usagers, Quentin Béran a étudié l'architecture de Wright à travers 4 thématiques. D'abord, la dimension autobiographique. Wright conçoit ses maisons-ateliers pour son usage personnel, ce qui lui permet d'expérimenter des solutions radicales et de créer une vitrine pour son œuvre. Ensuite, la relation à la nature. Chaque maison est en dialogue étroit avec son environnement et aucune hiérarchie n'est créée entre le naturel et l'artificiel qui dialoguent d'égal à égal. Troisième aspect, la notion d'espace wrightien. Des volumes ouverts et amples, mais qui comprennent également des zones plus intimes, pensées comme refuge. Enfin, l'expérience vécue. Comment l'habitant en mouvement découvre progressivement l'espace grâce à un parcours dynamique et non linéaire qui aboutit à une expérience active et pleine de surprises.
À une époque où les constructions et les agglomérations urbaines ne cessent de croître et de gagner en importance, notre environnement se compose principalement de réalisations humaines. Et donc, ces constructions, elles répondent à des besoins primaires, mais elles font souvent abstraction d'un élément qui est pourtant capital et qui est celui du bien-être de leurs usagers. Dans ma recherche, l'objectif principal est de mettre en lumière les éléments propices à la création d'un environnement qui soit positif et qui nous permette de nous épanouir. À partir des résultats obtenus, il est possible d'étendre ces considérations à la construction contemporaine. Ces éléments peuvent être analysés donc à l'échelle de la maison, mais également à celle de la ville, afin de créer des environnements qui soient propices à notre bien-être et qui répondent également aux ambitions du vivre ensemble. Mesdames et messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, receiving this Latsis University Prize from the University of Geneva is a great honor. My research, as you've just seen and heard, was on Frank Lloyd Wright, the American architect. And very often we know of his works under his own name, when in actual fact he always worked in a team. So it's something that needs to be put to his own credit, but also to the community around him. In the same way, I would like to share this distinction with the team who helped me, supported me during this adventure. Thank you to the University of Geneva, first and foremost, to have given me an atmosphere, setting conducive to my research. Thanks to the Unity of Art History, including Professor Stauffer, who directed my work, for her optimism that she always displayed during this entire adventure. Thanks to my parents and my wife for their unwavering support and their trust. Thank you to the Latsis Foundation for this beautiful distinction. Receiving this prize is a great accomplishment that comes with great responsibility, i.e. Continuing to strive for excellence and contribute to progress in knowledge. Thank you very much.
J'invite maintenant la...
I would now like to invite the Vice Rector Martine Collard to join me on stage to award the prize and for an official picture.
Très bien.
And the prize is right below. That was self-evident. And I guess there should be a photographer somewhere.
Voilà, deuxième lauréat distingué par...
The second laureate honored by the Latsis Foundation is Professor Rasmus Kin from ETHZ for his research in the area of theoretical computer science that led to major breakthroughs in the development of algorithms. And here is
Algorithms are the recipes that computers follow in order to solve problems. And as we seek to analyze ever larger data sets, we need very fast algorithms to process all this data.
Professor King's group has created radically faster algorithms for many computational problems on networks. We can find network structures everywhere. Think of internet traffic, transportation, logistics, social ties, and physical systems such as electric grids, or even heat flows through physical material. Two important examples of the group's work include efficient software for understanding electrical flows in networks of resistors, and theoretical algorithms for logistical problems, like planning cargo trains to route goods through a network. As theoretical computer scientists, the group begins by formally proving that efficient algorithms exist using mathematical models and formal analyses of the algorithmic process itself. When this succeeds, the group works on turning these theoretical algorithms into practical, useful software.
Yes, this two-stage process has been very useful. Stage one is to design an algorithm that provably scales well, but without worrying whether it works well in practice. And then stage two is to try to discover a simpler algorithm that truly works well in practice.
Consider the problem of electric flows. A theoretical breakthrough in the early 2000s showed that electrical flows could be computed quickly, at least in theory. Yet usable code remained elusive. How can this be? The breakthrough algorithm of the 2000s had the property that as the network size doubles, the time spent computing the flow roughly doubles. This is much better than traditional methods, such as Gaussian elimination, where the time grows by a factor 8 when doubling the input size. But the 2000s breakthrough algorithm is impractical. Even running it on a tiny network with a handful of nodes would take decades. Professor King uncovered simple, practical algorithms and proved why they work using random matrix theory that originated in quantum mechanics. This algorithm both has excellent scaling and it runs quickly on real-world data sets.
Back in 2022, we achieved a breakthrough. We can now solve a huge range of problems in time that scales almost linearly in the problem size. We were focusing on assignment and logistics problems that are fundamental to computer science. Things like matching workers with jobs, or matching taxis with riders, or routing digital traffic. Together with collaborators, we introduced a new framework that merges gradient descent methods with novel network data structures, and this led us to much faster solutions. And now we're working on turning this into powerful, real-world tools that people can use. I think I have a moment to say thank you, and maybe a clicker here. Oh, yeah. So I want to thank the Latsis Foundation and the ETH Research Commission for recognizing my work in this way. And I want to thank my partner, who's a great support and makes it enjoyable to live life while doing this research. And ETH and my department, which creates a wonderful environment in which to do research. And then this is my group and alumni. And this is really an incredible group of people to work with, so that's a real blessing. It's what makes it enjoyable to do research, and then they're an amazing team. And also you see here, ETH base funding and funding from the SNF is what makes this possible. And I put these slides together while sitting in Berkeley, where I was running a workshop. And so the last thing that occurred to me is that we should be thankful that we're in a place where there's still consensus about fundamental scientific values. Yeah. and so I put this here. And then there were some specific works being mentioned in this video, and I also want to highlight collaborators. Going slightly in the wrong order here. These are some of the wonderful people that I worked with on these works. And right, this was what I thought, and thank you for the applause, for the scientific values, right? So public investment is necessary for scientific research and academic freedom and a critical perspective, and not everywhere is this consensus anymore. So thank you.
J'invite le professeur Sauer à me rejoindre sur scène pour la remise du prix.
I'd like to invite Professor Sauer to join me on stage.
Le prix est là. Nous avons découvert le photographe qui n'est pas au pied de la scène, qui est juste derrière, mais il était bien là. Notre troisième lauréat, le professeur Philippe Schwaller, a été nommé par l'EPFL pour ses travaux novateurs sur l'intégration de l'intelligence artificielle et des modèles de langage dans les sciences chimiques, et une vidéo vous sera présentée pour son travail.
My lab works at the intersection between modern machine learning and chemistry, and what we are targeting is like building valuable tools for chemists that augment their capabilities and that have a practical impact in the real world to accelerate scientific discovery.
The discovery of new molecules is a colossal challenge. This chemical space contains millions of possible combinations, each requiring years of research. These discoveries have a direct impact on our daily lives. They enable the creation of more effective medicines, sustainable materials, the technology that improves health, the environment, and our quality of life. Philippe Schwaller and his team are using artificial intelligence to develop language models capable of reading and writing chemistry like a language. These tools predict reactions, design molecules, and automatically plan experiments, accelerating research.
modern chemical research generates vast design spaces for new medicine, materials or processes. However, scientists, they lack of the tools to efficiently navigate those spaces. My lab is thinking about how we can use machine learning and AI and provide those tools to actually find the needle in the haystack and to navigate those spaces more efficiently to accelerate scientific discovery.
Reaction prediction and synthesis planning are among the most challenging problems in computational chemistry. His approach focuses on three main areas: predicting reactions and planning synthesis using neural networks, designing new molecules efficiently through reinforced learning, and creating AI agents capable of reasoning and acting with specialized tools, such as ChemCro. In each area, he developed novel methods addressing fundamental bottlenecks, from predicting reactions with confidence and planning syntheses, to efficiently discovering new molecules, to enable autonomous experimental planning.
At the forefront of machine learning in chemistry, and we are working with pharmaceutical companies, but also with technology companies like IBM and Intel to kind of use the methods we develop here and bridge closer to the real world. We're trying to come up with algorithms that could discover maybe new medicines faster, that make chemical reactions more sustainable. It's a huge honor to receive that prize, but I also get so much satisfaction whenever one of my team members wins a best paper award, the best poster prize, best presentation or whatever. I'm just incredibly proud about the successes of my team members, and I think I complete my missions when they shine and they go on and they become something better than when they started in my lab.
Thank you very much. Yeah, as you've seen in the video, my team and I are exploring how to use machine learning to accelerate chemical discovery. We ask questions like what molecules to make, to how to make them, and we often use language models to do that, keeping experimental validation always in our mind. You've likely heard of ChatGPT and large language models. 2 years ago, those large language models were very limited. Now, if you go to ChatGPT, you see something like a web search. And when language model can call tools like a web search, we call them agents. And we applied this concept to chemistry, augmenting an LLM with chemistry tools in our ChemCro publication. Let me just give you an example. Synthesizing an insect repellent. So ChemCro went on, queried the literature, and found DEET as a target. I have to click. And then converted that to something, a representation that AI could actually better understand. Given that, it could use synthesis planning tools that I had previously developed and basically predict a recipe for this compound. And finally, after human confirmation, because we connected it to a robot, autonomously synthesized that molecule. This is somehow some work that unlocks almost an AI scientist and paves the way towards more automated chemical discovery. So, yeah, I think all along my academic career, I was very fortunate to work with brilliant collaborators. I was supported by excellent mentors. And I also received substantial funding early on from EPFL, from agencies and industrial partners who were not afraid to invest in a young scientist like me. I would like to thank all of them. But most importantly, I would not be here in front of you today without my amazing team at EPFL, including members representing more than 20 nationalities. This award really belongs to them. I would also like to give a special thank you to you for listening, to the Latsis Foundation for this very prestigious award, and to my family, which is here tonight, for their continuous support. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Merci vraiment.
J'invite maintenant la vice-présidente à l'EPFL, Stéphanie Lacour, de nous rejoindre pour la remise du prix. J'invite maintenant notre dernier lauréat, le professeur Martin Wolf, last but not least, distingué par l'Université de Saint-Gall pour ses recherches en macroéconomie, économie monétaire et croissance, ainsi que pour ses publications reconnues dans des revues particulièrement prestigieuses, et son travail va être présenté de nouveau par une petite vidéo.
My name is Martin Wolf. I am an assistant professor for monetary economics at the University of St. Gallen. In my latest research, I study the implications of very high debt for our economies. The motivation is that debt levels are currently very high in many advanced countries, both the debt of governments, but also the debt of the private sector, such as households and firms.
Government debt in many countries has increased enormously in recent years. For example, in the US, it has doubled in the last 20 years, and Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act will only reinforce this trend over the coming years. In his research with Luca Fornaro, Martin argues that very high government debt can reduce countries' growth. Intuitively, to stabilise the debt-to-GDP ratio, costly measures such as profit taxes or lower public investment may be required, which lower firms' investment. One example of this dynamic is perhaps provided by Italy. The Italian debt-to-GDP ratio has climbed to very high levels already in the 1980s. To sustain the public debt, policymakers were forced to raise taxes and to slash public investments. Interestingly, during this period, productivity growth in Italy has slowed markedly. Indeed, some observers have pointed to the high degree of fiscal distortions in Italy as one cause of the productivity growth slowdown.
The issue with high debt causing low growth is that this sets in motion an amplification effect. As GDP grows more slowly, this pushes up the debt-to-GDP ratio even more. As Luca and I show in our research, once debt levels exceed a tipping point, this vicious cycle can become sufficiently strong so that the country becomes stuck in a high debt and low growth equilibrium from which it is very hard to escape.
Finally, also the debt of the private sector has increased in recent years. There is a risk that this leverage translates into another financial crisis, especially when interest rates rise. This may imply that central banks feel constrained in their ability to raise interest rates, a phenomenon called financial dominance.
As I show in research with Leopold Sessner, financial dominance can become an extremely persistent phenomenon through a self-fulfilling prophecy. The private sector may come to expect a weak monetary response to inflationary pressure due to financial dominance. When this happens, interest rate expectations fall, which pushes up asset values. Because borrowing in the economy is often tied to asset values, this keeps leverage in the economy high. Finally, as the central bank responds to high leverage with low interest rates, this validates the initial beliefs by the private sector. In summary, I warn about two risks of very high debt for our economies. Fiscal stagnation, that is a protracted period of high government debt and slow growth, and the idea that monetary policy can become less effective at controlling inflation due to self-fulfilling beliefs of financial dominance.
It's a great honor for me to receive the Latsis Prize tonight. It's a great privilege to be a researcher and to be able to work on the topics that you think are important. It's also a great joy. And it's an even greater joy when you feel that your work makes a difference and that others share your views about what is important. So thank you very much to the Latsis Foundation for this recognition. When I learned in St. Gallen that I will receive the Latsis Prize in this year, one of my colleagues told me, "You can be very proud. Those who had received the Latsis Prize in the past went on to have impressive careers." I certainly hope that this is a causal effect of the Latsis Prize that will also apply to me. I will do my best. But of course, research is a team effort, and I wouldn't be standing here tonight without my team members. I want to thank, in particular, my two co-authors, Luca Fornaro and Leopold Zessner-Spitzenberg, who are working with me on the research line that you have seen in the video. First, Luca Fornaro, who is working at CRE in Barcelona, is certainly the smartest person that I have ever met, and working with him is a great privilege. Leopold Zessner is a young macroeconomist at the Technical University of Vienna. He is extremely talented, and I'm sure will produce lots of impactful research in the coming years. In St. Gallen, I want to thank Dominik Sachs and Winfried Königer for their continued guidance, and also for proposing me for the Latsis Prize this year. And I also want to thank my other colleagues in St. Gallen for creating a stimulative but also friendly and supportive working environment which allows young researchers to thrive. Finally, I also want to thank my family. I want to thank my two small children for keeping me up at night, which allows me to think about research even at times when other people sleep. And I want to thank my wife, Penelope, for bearing with me also through the difficult times in the life of a researcher. Thank you.
J'invite le professeur Klaus Müller, directeur de l'Institut de contrôle de gestion et d'audit, à monter sur scène. Merci. C'est mon grand plaisir, maintenant mon privilège de pouvoir introduire la conférence de ce soir. It's a great honor for me to welcome tonight's guest speaker, Mary Bird, one of the most famous classicists in the world, and in inspiring public voice in history, culture, and power. Mary Bird is the Emeritus Professor of Classics at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Newman College, where she's taught and inspired a generation of students for almost 40 years. Her books, from Pompeii, the life of a Roman town, to the international bestseller SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome, have changed the way we look at the Roman world, while her book, Women and Power, a Manifesto, has also encouraged deep reflection on gender and authority in the past and today. Beyond academia, Mary has brought the classic to a very large public through her BBC documentaries, such as Meet the Romans and Rome, Empire Without Limits, as well as with her articles, her blogs, and her recent podcast. Her achievements have been recognized with many awards, including the Getty Medal, the Princess of Astoria Award for Social Sciences, and sorry, Mary, I have to say that, and the title of Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, given by Queen Elizabeth II. I'm sorry because Mary didn't want that I mention it, but I have to mention it in the public in Geneva. Mary reminds us that history is never finished, that each generation must ask new questions about the past to better understand our world and its evolution. Her latest book, Empower From, continues this exploration, showing us what it truly meant to hold power in the Roman world. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Mary Bird. Thank you very much.
Mesdames, Messieurs, chers lauréats, Ou en anglais, lords, ladies, gentlemen and dames, I think we say. Can I say how honored I am to be here giving this lecture, and I would love to add my congratulations to the prize winners, and also to echo what they've been saying about the importance of funding of research and the importance of research at the center of a democratic community. And for that, we are in part, of course, very grateful to the Latsis Foundation, all of us, for what they do to support this. But I want to start, because I'm a long way from all this AI stuff, all this artificial intelligence is past me. I want to start with a painting by the British-Dutch artist Laurens Alma Tadema. It's entitled The Roses of Heliogabalus, and it was first shown in a London exhibition in 1888. Now, according to reports at the time, some visitors stood in front of this painting and all they wondered was how to pronounce the name Heliogabalus, right? More of them appeared baffled by what on earth was going on in the picture. Most of them did not know the story of the young 3rd century Roman emperor Heliogabalus, or I'm going to be calling him more often Elagabalus, who was supposed to have invited some upmarket guests to dinner, and at the end of the party, with the dawn, as you can see, already breaking, showered rose petals on them from the ceiling. Now, this was a favorite trick of elite Romans at the end of a dinner party, and it was always a bit dangerous. One emperor reputedly showered unripe fruit onto his guests. It was very hard, and they came away with a lot of bruises. But in this case, there were so many flower petals that the guests smothered and died, right? Now, you can see from the details of some of their faces that a few of them have already worked out that this party is not going to end well, right? Now, this lecture is going to ask what we are supposed to make, what we can now make of such unlikely, implausible stories of Roman imperial power, and what those stories might still have to tell us. Now, Elagabalus will be my lead character among the many Roman emperors. God, this is a terrible lineup of blokes, isn't it? Among the many Roman emperors who ruled from the mid-1st century BC on, after the collapse of the sort of democracy of earlier Rome. As you see, you've got a good selection of them. They all look the same, don't they, on the screen. Elagabalus is not a great, well-known name, right? He came to the throne aged 14 in 218 CE, and he was deposed 4 years later in 222. His family came from Emesa in Syria, which is modern Homs, and it was his grandmother who had connections with the imperial court who engineered his rise to power. 4 years, remember he's only 14, 4 years and 4 marriages later, it was Granny again, so the story went, who engineered him off the throne once more, now aged 18. It wasn't a happy ending. He was supposedly killed in a latrine. The hit squad then tried to push his body down a sewer, and when they couldn't get it in, they threw it in the Tiber. Right? and he is, I suppose, one of the main victims of my title. Now, he's gone down in history as a sadistic, deranged tyrant. And the focus of stories that are weird and hostile, even by the usual standards of criticism that we find directed at Roman emperors. There were charges that he practiced child sacrifice, that he chose his advisors by the size of their genitals, and there were claims that he established a female senate. Now, for most Romans, that wasn't a great liberal reform. That was a terrible subversion of the established male order. There were also stories, like several dynasts and dictators of the modern world, that he had a perverse fascination with footwear. Now, people my age may remember this infamous shoe collection of Imelda Marcos, wife of the dictator of the Philippines. Well, like Imelda Marcos, Elagabalus was supposed never to have worn the same pair of shoes twice. And that's before you get to his planned religious revolution, replacing Jupiter at the head of the Roman pantheon with the god Elagabal of his native Emesa, from whom his name derives. It's also before you get to his challenge to what we would call binary views of gender, insisting, for example, that he be addressed as a woman. Like the female senate, in Roman terms, this was definitely not radical sexual politics. It was utterly subversive. Though, don't forget, at the same time, he also supposedly had those 4 heterosexual marriages in the space of 4 years. Now, Alma Tadema's painting picks up a rather more domestic theme in his vices. Roman emperors were often judged by how they behaved or what they served at dinner. And Elagabalus was renowned as a dangerously ingenious host. Beyond this rose petal trick and beyond the exotic haute cuisine, it was said that flamingo brains were one of his favorite delicacies. And beyond the weird menus, such as the color-coded banquets consisting entirely of green food or of red food, he loved humiliating his guests, even when he didn't kill them. Sometimes he seated them on inflatable cushions, which were deflated during the evening, leaving them on the floor, right? Now, he was a teenager, remember, and that might explain that one. On other occasions, he would turn his guests into figures of fun in a different way. He would line up, for example, 8 bald men to share his dinner, or 8 one-eyed men, or 8 men with gout, or 8 very fat men who made everyone else cruelly laugh because they couldn't fit on the dining couches together, right? Or he would let his tame lions and tigers in after dinner to give the guests a scare and sometimes to kill them too, simply by frightening them to death, even though the animals were tame. In short, the figure of Elagabalus, though now little known, offers an image of a Roman tyrant vastly and luridly, and sometimes ludicrously, magnified. We don't find any other Roman ruler described quite so extremely, although there are clear overlaps between these stories and some slightly more familiar stories told of better-known emperors. Other emperors also served color-coded dinners. One hosted a dinner entirely in black, which was uncomfortably reminiscent of a funeral. Then there's the folly of Caligula, who in the early 1st century CE proposed to make his favourite racehorse a consul, the chief official of the Roman state. Here he is in a BBC TV series of the 1970s with the racehorse. And there are plenty of similar anecdotes about Nero too. Nero is supposed to have been so proud, for example, of his performances on stage that he locked the audience inside the theatre and let no one leave until he'd finished. You know, we've barred the doors here, I can tell you. So that women gave birth in their seats and men pretended to be dead in order to escape. Now, that is not on the same scale as Elagabalus, to be sure, but it's on the same spectrum of imperial cruelty and idiosyncrasy, and it reflects some of the same themes. And some of those stories are still part of our own popular culture. Roman emperors and their misdemeanors are still part and parcel of our image and language of power and its abuse, a bit like Imelda Marcos and her shoes. But there's also hardly a modern political leader who has not been caricatured as if he was Nero in 64 CE, playing his lyre while the city of Rome went up in flames. You can spot some favourites there. Boris Johnson, Barack Obama, Bolsonaro, Berlusconi, and Mr. Trump. Right? So it's still, that image is still a common way that we have of attacking a politician who looks as if they're having fun when he or she should be concentrating on government. So, my first and preliminary question is, what do historians usually do with those tall, implausible, and odd stories? How do historians approach this? It may come as no surprise that to learn that, at least in relation to Elagabalus, back to him, a few historians have decided that basically it's just all fantasy. For a start, many of the stories are inherently implausible. I don't think you can actually smother people to death with rose petals. I might be wrong, but I think it would be very hard. Meanwhile, the surviving archaeological and documentary evidence for his reign largely gives a very different impression from the stories that I've just been telling you, showing that whatever the anecdotes of an emperor gone crazy, business was, in fact, under Elagabalus, carrying on as usual. There are, for example, plenty of surviving inscriptions on stone, recording the routine, legal, and other decisions of Elagabalus as a regular bureaucrat. The truth is, in fact, that all emperors spent much more time dictating letters and signing them than they spent in devising ingenious dinner parties. And it looks as if that was true for Elagabalus. And despite the orientalizing image that we are given of his Eastern religious revolution, the coins minted during his reign more often, as you see here, more often display him as a patron of traditional Roman religion, here with the god Mars and the goddess Roma. Anyway, some of the real skeptics argue, the main source, not the only, the main source for all this weird stuff is the so-called biography, and that's in inverted commas, of the emperor in one of the most puzzling and unbelievable and untrustworthy works in the whole of classical literature. That is a long series of emperors' biographies, 3 volumes in a modern edition, starting with Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, and going on a couple of hundred years. And it goes under the title, the Augustan or imperial history, the Historia Augusta in Latin. Now, why it's puzzling is it claims to be a composite joint work, an early kind of research project, by 6 named authors writing at the end of the 3rd century CE. When in fact, linguistic and other analysis shows, beyond any reasonable doubt, that it was written by a single, anonymous author 100 years later. Right? The whole thing, and the life of Elagabalus in this collection is the kind of centerpiece. The whole thing is a mixture of invention, exaggeration, fake documents, and weirdly learned allusions back to earlier literature. Now, I recommend it, I wholeheartedly recommend it, as a wonderfully mad read. But we're still struggling to work out what on earth it was for, right? Now, the best guess is that it was a satiric construction by a bored 4th or 5th century professor on his evenings off, a kind of an eerily postmodern bit of fake history. And it may be that, but if so, what I always think is, why on earth did he write 3 volumes of it? I mean, that's awfully long for a joke when 1 volume would have done. But whatever the explanation, it's hardly a solid source for the emperor's life, and for some historians, it's basically close to complete invention. No evidence for the emperor at all. Now, I have to say that most historians are not quite so radically dismissive. The usual tactic, if you don't get rid of the whole lot, is to say, look, there is some kernel of truth here. That's the usual tactic. After all, there are a few briefer accounts of Elagabalus's reign by men who lived through it, with themes that partly do overlap with what we find in the Augustan history. So instead, the usual idea is not to just chuck it away. The usual idea is that we should use judicious historical skepticism to try to divide the truth of this reign from the falsehood. Essentially, that means we should be, quote, good historians, and we should go through the accounts that have come down to us, rejecting the obviously implausible, like death by rose petals, and constructing a more plausible account out of what is left. We should also try to pinpoint the misunderstandings on which some of the extravagant anecdotes are based. One idea, for example, is that when the writer of the Augustan history refers to the tame lions and tigers that supposedly scared some of Elagabalus's dinner guests to death, he had simply misunderstood the role of those animals attached to the new temple of the god Elagabal, which the emperor had established. It was all terrible confusion, and we can see through that to the truth. Now, this kind of historical method is basically no more sophisticated than being a process of sieving, right? You put all the evidence that you have in a sieve, you shake it about to get rid of the rubbish, and you try to construct proper history out of what's left, right? And that's not only when we're dealing with Elagabalus. I mean, it's standard practice when we're looking at biographies of earlier imperial behaviour, and indeed it's standard practice in Roman history and much other history more generally. What you do is, the job is to dismiss the impossible or try to explain it by rationalising it into a different story. That is often tried, to give an earlier example, with a claim I mentioned a few minutes ago about the Emperor Caligula planning to make his horse a consul. Now, an enormous amount of scholarly energy has gone into this silly problem, right? But a typical modern rationalisation goes like this. Let's imagine that we're in the imperial palace and the emperor is getting exasperated with a group of courtiers and senators who won't do what he wants. And he shouts at them, partly as a joke, "You lot are completely hopeless. I might as well make my horse a consul as any of you." And so, it's argued, the story that Caligula wanted to make his horse a consul is born. It's born out of a misunderstood jest. Now, in some ways, that all sounds quite sensible. Right? Isn't that, you might say, what historians are supposed to do? Aren't historians supposed to come along and sort out the truth from the falsehood and to explain what seems unbelievable? Now, up to a point, maybe it is. But there's a glaringly obvious methodological problem here that is rarely mentioned. On what criteria do we decide whether some story is plausible or not? How do we know where to draw the line between truth and falsehood? What counts as a convincing explanation? Or if you go back to the idea of the sieve, how do you construct the sieve? There is basically something circular in this age-old traditional method. That is to say, we tend to accept or reject pieces of historical evidence to fit the kind of historical explanation that we want to find. And so to make the past make sense in terms that make sense to us. Well, there's something deeply, deeply circular. It might sometimes be right, but there's a problem. So in the rest of this talk, I want to take a very different direction. I'm going to throw away the sieve, and I shall not be asking which hostile stories about Roman emperors are true and which are not. Right? The only answer to that is that some are true, I guess, and some aren't, but in most cases we haven't the foggiest clue which is which, and no amount of analysing the ancient sources will help us very much. I want to stress instead that, true or not, these are stories that were repeatedly told and believed in the ancient world. These are stories with which Roman writers and Roman readers and Roman listeners constructed their image of power and its abuse. And for that reason alone, they demand our attention in their own terms. To put it another way, I'm looking for the symbolic truth in the fantasy. I'm not looking for the literal truth behind the fantasy. And I'm interested in what that fantasy can tell us about how Romans thought about one-man rule, how they thought about tyranny, and about the loss of liberty that tyranny entailed. Now, here again is my lineup of men. I should say that I'm concentrating here on stories of bad emperors, not the parallel stories that you might be able to find with a few good emperors. And while I'll continue to use Elagabalus as a bit of a thread, I hope to give you enough to see that in the Roman imagination, so-called bad emperors were all bad in the same way. Similar anecdotes get told about emperor after emperor. Elagabalus is extreme, but on the spectrum. What I'm hoping to do is expose the logic of these stories of the abuse of power that go far beyond, a logic that goes far beyond just curious tales or random acts of madness or idiosyncratic crimes that we still actually love to hear about, right? And while suggesting that it was through these stories that Roman writers defined and faced up to the abuse of power and to the nature of autocracy, I'm inevitably raising the question of whether those stories have a lesson for us too, as we also face up to autocracy in various forms and to a perception, at least, of the erosion of liberty. Do these stories speak to us if we look at them in a different way? Now, I say that I see a logic at the heart of these disparate, varied, weird tales. That logic, in brief, is this, and I'll give you it in its brief form, and then we'll look at it in more detail. I think these stories, true or not, construct an image of tyranny or autocracy as a peculiar kind of dystopia. Tyranny is a place in which the rules of nature and the shared conventions of meaning are repeatedly broken. It's a place where nothing is as it seems and which you can never believe your eyes. The claim that underlies these stories is really that autocracy, dictatorship, destroys our ability to trust our senses, to trust in the reality of what we think we see. One powerful Roman view, in other words, is that only political liberty guarantees that we can believe our eyes, that we can believe what we see. But that's the very telegraphic version. I now want to expand that with some examples, which I hope will fill it out. Out of the range of anecdotes told or often, I think, invented about Elagabalus, many of them focus on the way he subverts and undermines the natural order of things. He has piles of snow in his gardens in the summer, not in the winter. Heaven knows where he got it from. He never eats seafood when he's by the coast. He only eats seafood inland. And he fills his inland swimming pools with seawater only. Meanwhile, he sleeps during the day and he is awake through the night. Now, to some extent, that fits with other critiques of ancient tyranny, that the tyrant claims to be able to transcend or defy nature. The free Greeks back in the 5th century, for example, 5th century BC, decried the Persian king Xerxes, who came along and he whipped the straits of the Hellespont as if he was master of the sea. And when Julius Caesar reformed the Roman calendar, changing the length of the Roman year, he was accused of using his power to lord it over the natural course of the stars in the sky. What people said he thinks he can tell the stars what to do. Now, in these stories, and they're repeated, the power of the autocratic ruler challenges one basic principle of freedom in the Roman world, which is to be able to live in accordance with the rules of nature. Now, in some ways, that is a bit of a cliche of ancient philosophy. I think it's really important in Rome, but it is a bit of a stereotypical cliche. More interesting for me is the way these anecdotes point us to what autocracy does to how the world appears to us, right? Because it seems, in looking across the board at these stories, true or not, the regime of the tyrant attacks and destabilizes your senses. It means you don't see what you think you see. The imperial palace for these Roman writers is a world of fake. It's a fake world. And the closer you get to the emperor himself, the more fake it is. Now, one of Elagabalus's tricks, we are told, was to invite many guests to his grand banquets, but to serve real food only to the elite, and fake food made out of wood or wax to his lower status guests. So they had what looked like a delicious banquet in front of them, but it was inedible, and they had to look grateful while the people on the top table were busily tucking in to real food. Or you could go back to the lions and tigers. The lions were terrifying because they looked fierce, and so you might be frightened to death. But really, they were tame. And in conservative Roman terms, though I stress not necessarily ours, Elagabalus is a man who claims to be a woman. As one Roman writer observed, Elagabalus was actually a nickname, not his real name. And he said, the emperor is as fake as his name. So there's a sense that there is fakery and falsehood at the center of autocracy. But it goes even beyond that simple fakery. The power of the autocrat, the power of the tyrant, undermines the very nature of what representation and reality are. Now, one accusation in the Augustan history is that whenever adultery was shown on the stage, Elagabalus made the actors really do it, right? Now, that could be because Elagabalus liked a raunchy theatrical show and wasn't going to have any fake sex. He wanted sexually explicit shows. But I think in the telling, the more important logic there is that in Elagabalus's dystopian mad world, the distinction between representation and reality has become utterly confused. To put that another way, autocracy disrupts the social rules and conventions of how things mean. The autocrat doesn't know the difference between symbol and the conventions of symbols on which culture is based and the literal truth. Right? He can't tell a theatre from reality. And that was the case in religious symbolism too, when Elagabalus wanted to make a link, a religious link, between his own favourite cult of Elagabal and the sacred flame of the goddess Vesta. at the very heart of Roman religion, tended by 6 Vestal virgins, what did he do to make that link? He's supposed to have married a Vestal virgin, right? So destroying the whole point of the virginal cult. What he does is he misreads, he oversimplifies, he literalizes the complexity of religious symbolism by turning it into human sex. Now, these are not, I think, just a pile-up of random acts of madness. And it's not just about the transgressions, real or invented, of individual emperors. Embedded in these stories, there is a critical Roman discourse about autocracy and the misuse of power. And it points to a particular Roman formulation of the problems of one-man rule. Autocracy subverts nature, and it subverts what I've been calling the social conventions of meaning and representation. It trades in pretense and play acting where there should be truth, and it trades in reality where there should be play acting. And those are the themes that run through Roman discussions of imperial power more widely. Roman writers repeatedly return to the regime of these one-man rulers, of the emperors, as regimes where you can never know what is true, in which the criteria of truth are always uncertain. Now, I think in particular here of the ultimate centerpiece and guarantor of Roman power, that is military victory. One question that is repeatedly asked is, could you ever know if the military heroics of a Roman emperor were true? Had they actually happened? The answer was, you couldn't. And that is an absolutely fundamental challenge to Roman truth and the center of Roman power. You know, the victories and military heroics might just be stories, right? Now, 2 of the funniest examples of that come from the 1st century CE, because both the emperors Caligula and Domitian, it was said, celebrated or planned to celebrate triumphal processions to mark their victories over the Germans, which had, at the very least, been massively exaggerated, perhaps entirely invented. Now, these triumphal processions go back centuries. They were central to Roman identity and self-imaging. Successful generals drove in a chariot through the streets of the city. Their soldiers streamed behind them, their captive prisoners, and their loot and their booty went in front. But how could you have a triumphal procession if you hadn't actually taken any prisoners? Caligula's answer, it was said, was to dress up some Gauls as if they were Germans, dye their hair red, teach them a bit of the German language, and give them German names, right? Domitian is supposed to have done much the same, but he even used precious items from his palace's furniture store to take the place of the booty, which of course he hadn't got, because he hadn't actually fought anybody. Now, this is more than ludicrous. The message was that where these subversive, bad emperors were concerned, even in the triumph, you could never quite believe what you saw. And it wasn't actually, I should say, restricted to, quotes, bad emperors. There's a marvelous story about the last triumph of the emperor Trajan. Now, Trajan had had a very much a vanity campaign in Mesopotamia in the early 2nd century, and his conquests were given up basically within 6 months. Trouble was that also Trajan died on the way back home, and his successor, Hadrian, wondered what to do about this. He'd already given up the conquests. He celebrates a triumphal procession in honor of the Emperor Trajan, but the victories had already been defeated. The conquests had already been lost. The emperor himself, who'd made them spuriously, really, was dead. So they had a triumphal procession, but they put a wax model in the place of the emperor. So you start to see right at the heart of this kind of ceremonial, there is always looking at you, is the sense you might be having a celebration for a dead emperor for victories he didn't really have. All right? Now, I think that's quite crucial. But another way of framing this was, again, in terms of reality versus stage performance. Part of the idea that you see, again, repeatedly, is that autocracy could only ever be a charade. Autocracy could only ever be play acting. Now, that is why the Emperor Nero's performances on stage that I mentioned were so loaded and so decried by ancient authors. Have we got an emperor who is only an actor? They were, in a way, an admission that there was nothing more to the emperor than an actor. And that admission had been built into the imperial regime from the very start, and from the best emperor of all, the first emperor, Augustus. Now, he is given an elaborate deathbed scene in 14 CE. It's well into his 70s. A very famous moment. And in one account, true or not, central to the deathbed scene was Augustus asking for a mirror, asking to have his hair combed, and then reciting a couple of lines of poetry. And this is what he recited. "Since I have played my part well, give me a clap and dismiss me from the stage with applause." The thought there is that already from the very beginning, to be a Roman emperor was no more than playing the part of the Roman emperor on the stage. And that's really hardwired into Roman thought. Now, there are important wider implications here for Roman political culture. It's often assumed that under the emperors, the Roman political class was not particularly acute in theorizing imperial power and corruption. To be sure, they criticized and they conspired against individual emperors, but for the most part, we usually say, they did not dissect or look at very hard the problems of autocracy as a system. Now, the main exception to that rule might be the 2nd century historian Tacitus, who does imply, in a way that's very reminiscent of George Orwell in the 20th century, and which aligns with what I've been saying, Tacitus does imply that one-man rule or tyranny at Rome destroyed language. It destroyed the meaning of words in a very Orwellian way. By and large, though, our assumption is that the system of autocracy was very quickly taken for granted at Rome, even if there were violent disagreements about who exactly should occupy the throne. Now, up to a point, I think that's true. There is no clear evidence after the middle of the 1st century CE, that is less than 100 years into one-man rule, that anybody proposed dismantling the system of tyranny, autocracy itself in practice. But my argument is that there is much more to Roman responses than that if we're prepared to take what they said and what they wrote seriously instead of trying to argue it away. That embedded in what we often dismiss as trivia or as stories that need to be corrected, saved, and explained away, there is a very strong theoretical position on the corrosive power of tyranny and one-man rule. Tyranny disrupts your senses, it justifies falsehood, and it turns the world into a distorting mirror. So, to finish, are there lessons here for us? Now, I am usually quite sceptical about what we can directly learn from Roman history in any specific sense. People always ask me, which emperor do I think President Trump is most like, right? You know, and I have two responses to that. One is to give the questioner a little lecture that they didn't want on why any such comparison is completely stupid. You know, there is, I mean, not only is it a completely different world, but what the hell would you learn by saying that Trump was the new Nero? It doesn't tell you anything. What do you do with that? No. It's a party game which might be amusing, but it's no more. Usually I have to say that doesn't go down very well. It's not what the questioner wanted. So it's easiest to just give them an answer. And I usually do say simply, Elagabalus. Now, I have to say that I'm not a great admirer of Mr. Trump, but I don't think for a minute that he's similar to Elagabalus, actually. But as a teacher, you know, I know that first of all the questioner will say, Ella, now how exactly do you spell that? And then they'll go and Google him, right? And they will have learnt something. So, you know, I'm not trying to denigrate Trump as a kind of man who invented a whoopee cushion. But, you know, at least you think, right, I've opened somebody's eyes to a different version of the Roman emperor. So I think in those kind of terms of, you know, can we make one-to-one comparisons? I think it's silly. But I think there is perhaps a lesson on a broader scale, which is not actually limited simply to the current resident of the White House. For me, these Roman reflections about the collapse of truth and reality under false impressions, fakes, charades, and lies in autocracy, they do prompt us, I hope, to look more closely at the conditions of our own political systems and at the question of how far our own ideas of truth and reality and the social conventions of meaning can ever stand up or do stand up against the challenges of fake news, pretense, lies, and misleading fake fantasies. Right? Now, I'm sure you all know what I mean, and I don't think I'm going to spell it out to you, but we can share chat afterwards about where we have that sense that the removal of true political debate has somehow subverted what it is to be a citizen and the kind of world that we live in. And I think that actually Alma Tadema was already onto this over a century ago. Because just to finish, I do want to say that this is not just for me a painting of a luxurious display that's gone wrong. It's not a painting which illustrates a nasty sense of humor on the part of a teenage emperor. It is a painting of, oh, by the way, I haven't said, Elagabalus is the one person you can really see clearly in the middle. He's lying down, right? It's not just you know, a picture of a curious anecdote. It is a painting which evokes a dystopian world in which the meaning of human interaction has gone so far awry that what appears to be generous, the rose petals, is actually deadly. This is emperors killing with kindness. And that's what emperors do. If they're kind to you, you're dead. Thank you very much. I think we've got time for questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary, for this very inspiring conference. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions from the audience. So if you want to raise your hand, there are some mic in the room, in the audience. If I can give the floor to somebody, maybe. We don't see you very well, but I'm sure that, yeah, there is one question there. Thank you very much. If you can ask question maybe also in French, or is it? It will work, I think. It will work. Yeah, it will work, yeah. So go ahead, please, there. Yeah, it's fine, thank you.
Attributed thanks. I wanted to ask you regarding this pattern of laws attributed to bad emperors. Is there also a similar, maybe opposite pattern of virtues attributed to so-called good emperors that you also mentioned?
To some extent, the answer to that is yes. That, you know, and you can, in a sense, flip what I've said to reflect what good emperors might do. You know, good emperors, you know, invite you round and you have a very simple supper and it's all nice and everybody is in first name terms. You don't have to kiss their feet. You know, they're modest, and you can build that up really against what I've been saying. I think that what I think is interesting is that, a bit like what I said about Trajan or Augustus from the very beginning, absolute classic good emperor, there's always a hint of the bad, you know, you can't ever get rid of the bad emperor, even from a good emperor. Augustus is already admitting that he's just an actor, that you can't believe. You know, Nero is on his deathbed and he wants his hair put right, for crying out loud, right? Now, there is no emperor that is more determinative of the good sides of the Roman world. That's true, but there's the seeds of the bad are already there. And the seeds of the bad are there in the whole ambiance of the Roman palace. And though I think I couldn't point to any Roman writer actually saying this, there is a very strong implication, particularly when we think of what is also decried in Rome, and I didn't talk about it, the idea, this goes to Tacitus's idea of the destruction of language under an autocracy. That you've got the idea that flattery is the only genre. Now, if you want some examples of flattery, I think the current court of America does produce some, actually, if you go and search them out. But then you see there is something more corrosive, really, which kind of gets everybody. Because I came away thinking, look, part of all this is that in an autocratic world, the one person who kind of knows that no one ever speaks the truth to him is the emperor. The emperor is the one person in the palace to whom everybody lies. Now, I think that's also very easy to see in modern political debate. We know that the news that gets to the President of the United States is filtered. We know that it's flattering. The same thing happens with the British Prime Minister. It's not. This is not just kind of some mad Trumpian bit. That part of the game of the modern political cabal is to make sure that the person who leads doesn't ever know what's really happening. And you see that, you can see them hinting that. So that's why I say I don't think there's any one-to-one comparison, but I think there's the sense of a real undermining of how you know what's true is very similar between Rome and between the Roman Empire. And now, you could probably do it for the medieval monarchs too, but I don't know about medieval monarchs.
Thank you. There maybe two questions. Yes. There.
So while listing the traits of the tyrants, you were saying they usually disrupt the senses, they justify falsehood, they disrupt social conventions. Are these characteristics functional to their power, or are they just personality traits they share?
I think that's a very good question, because I think if you ask me what really happened in the Roman imperial palace, I have no idea. None of us have any idea. But so I think the most you can say, and I think it's important, so I don't apologize for this being the most you can say, is that when Romans try to make sense of what they're seeing, what they are doing is imagining it in terms of that kind of dystopian undermining of the senses. You can't, and I think that's where the rose petals come in. I mean, probably it never happened, right? Most of these never happened. It doesn't matter, right? This is post-truth history, and it's good for that. What you can see is that the sense-making processes of Roman writers when confronted by autocracy is to put it in those terms. Now, I'm playing fast and loose there, but I think we don't know. I mean, one of the problems is, as I said about Elagabalus, and it's the same for every single one of these emperors. There is no sign in the documentary record anywhere that things are going wrong under any of them. It can be a complete madman on the throne, but decisions get made, things get done, laws get made, just as they always had. Now, you could say, of course, and this is a particularly frightening version of autocracy, but one that I'm quite tempted by, that actually the autocrat is just a black hole. The autocrat doesn't do anything. The autocrat, whoever runs the Roman world, it's not the emperor. Whoever runs America, it's not the president. Whoever runs Britain, it's not the prime minister. But what you have is you have a cipher of corruption at the middle, and everybody else is getting on with the business. Now, maybe our politics is more like that. I don't know, but it's what really happened behind the closed doors of the palace is a mystery, and will remain one.
Thank you, sir. I think there was another question right to the right of, yeah.
It was just to support my friends. And
Okay. So maybe, yeah, there is one there first, yeah, and then.
First off, thank you for a remarkable lecture that will resonate greatly with me as I fly back to the US tomorrow.
Oh, good.
But my question has to do with representation, because I think there are two categories of representation. There's the sanctioned representation from the autocrat, and then there's representation that isn't necessarily coming from that source. Yeah. And to what extent do they collapse onto one another, in your view?
Yeah. I mean, I think they probably do collapse onto one another, or at least in the process of our accessing them, they collapse. I mean, one thing that we know, and in fact throughout Roman history, and to some extent I should have said this, but I didn't have time, is that the idea of whether the political leader is an actor or not is one that goes back before autocracy. In fact, when Cicero, in the dying days of the Republic, is wanting to theorize oratory, one of the things that he gets worried about is whether the orator is anything more than an actor. And of course, you can go back to the Greek world, plenty of stuff in Plato and others about that. And there is a problem about the convergence or not of our representation of him and his representation of himself. And I don't know how you unpick that, but it's that one of the things that runs through, I mean, it becomes much more apparent under the autocracy of empire than it was before, but the stage is never very far away from how people think about, how people represent, or I think about what the emperor does. And, you know, I was always brought up to kind of laugh at those anecdotes about Nero, you know. So he goes to the theatre and he's so pleased with himself and he says, you know, no one's going to leave. Actually, it's saying this is about autocracy being play acting and you are not everybody escaping. You know, Nero goes out having all this in inverted commas, having great nights on the town and bashing up unfortunate people in the street because, you know, and he's in disguise. You know, is an emperor in disguise still an emperor, right? And so you have this real theme of theatricality with all its downsides, I think, which by and large is not part and parcel of modern ways of understanding how the Romans thought about themselves. But you're right. I mean, I can't answer the question.
Yeah. I think there is another one. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. If I understand the thesis correctly, basically what you're saying is that some people in the ancient world, the authors of this crazy, odd stories, understand the boundary between representation and reality, between tyranny and freedom. So my question to you would be, to what extent do you think that the audience of these authors understood these tales in this way?
Yeah. That's extremely difficult to know. And I fudged that because I think it would be reasonable to say that the readers of elite texts, and we could go back to Suetonius, which would be an easier example, though not quite such a florid example, of imperial biography in the 2nd century, where these themes get, you can see these themes once you're attuned to them. How far any of this goes past an elite readership group largely in Rome, I don't know. I think there is, if you wanted to try to push it a bit further than that and to say this is a more popular way, I think you'd go back to theatre and you'd go back to some of the occasions when theatre was used, as we are told by these elite writers, theatre was used as a way of exposing the failings of the emperor concerned. You know, so there are all kinds of stories like, and I think it's Marcus Aurelius. I think that the supposed lover of Marcus Aurelius, his wife, was also a performer. And so you're beginning to see, or to get a slight sniff when people talk about, look, the emperor's wife's lover is there playing the adulterous man in the theatre. You're starting to see that possibly there is a kind of a wider version of those issues. But by and large, you know, if you take the 50 million inhabitants of the Roman Empire, then 49.5 million wouldn't give a shit, I think, and know much about it. I mean, we are talking about the elite, the elite bubble, actually, I think. And of course, it's the elite bubble that politicians have been, that the West has been reading ever since. So it's not a nugatory bubble. It never burst. Right?
Thank you. I don't know if there are maybe one last one. Yes, there, please. I don't know if there are a mic here, just on the third rank. Thank you. Somebody is running there, very fast.
Gosh.
Sorry, I think there was the one here. Sorry for that, but maybe we'll have the chance. So here, yeah. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. I was actually wondering whether you would say that maybe Marcus Aurelius is an exception to that, to the extent that he tried to implement Stoicism into his own life and exercise of power?
I shouldn't have mentioned Marcus Aurelius because I can't bear. I mean, I can't bear many of these emperors, but I can't bear him. I am absolutely amazed. I think the Meditations are extremely interesting text, but I think that exactly the same happened. I mean, we have become won by the Meditations. Now, I don't know how many people here have read them in the original Greek, but I tell you, they're not half as interesting as in the translations that you can pick up on the self-help sections of local bookshops. I mean, I have to say, if Marcus Aurelius is going to give you help in your career, on Amazon, he is in the finding a job section, right? Marcus Aurelius. Now, so we have somehow, and I think it's interesting actually, I get told off whenever I say this, we have somehow kind of made Marcus Aurelius one of us because, Bill Clinton, apparently had the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius by his bedside, trying to say, American president sleeps with the writings of a Roman emperor. Now, almost everything, I mean, what I think I recommend to anyone who thinks I'm being unfair to Marcus Aurelius is equally interesting but completely different are the letters exchanged between him and his tutor Fronto early in his career, where you find a version of this person that we've turned into a saint, looking for all the world like the guys I've been talking about.
So there sorry, but one last question there on the left, right for you.
But if I had some of my philosophical colleagues with me, they would tell me off for saying that about Marcus Aurelius.
I have a question. If you're saying that things continued as usual without the emperor really knowing the real truth, the real reality, do you mean actually that it was like a deep state like we have today that is ruling and the bureaucrats is actually running the place, and the tyrants were not really the tyrants? Or maybe they were tyrants because of their personality, the caprice personality, but they were not the real ones who made the decisions. The deep state drove the decisions the way they wanted.
I think that I could go in that direction. I think that you never lose the figure of the emperor. The person you see everywhere is the emperor, repeated and repeated and repeated. That's true. But how the system worked, and the British always want to say they have a civil service, and it isn't like that at all. I mean, we can see the people who are doing some of the work. And there's no, I mean, Weber would say, look, this is not a bureaucracy. This is a kind of patrimonial family. Because there is no structure, there is no career system, there's no exams, there's no, and you get appointed for reasons that we simply don't know. But when you go through these guys, it is really, really hard ever to pin down them doing anything. Now, of course they sign things off. Of course it comes out in their names. In which case, there's then you have got my kind of black hole. So you've got a vision of tyranny, and I suppose you have to go to dinner with the emperor. There isn't, and tyranny is acted out. But there's a great novel translated from the German about Ovid, actually, by a guy called Christoph Ransmayr. And I haven't read it in German, but I have read it in English. He has a terribly vivid image at the very beginning. He takes you inside the imperial palace. He's going to go off and do all kinds of clever things about Ovid and the Metamorphoses. But you just get a glimpse of Augustus. And Augustus is sitting on his own in his room, watching his pet hippopotamus.
So I think I'm sorry we have to close the session of the discussion. But thank you very much again, Mary, for being such. Merci infiniment de votre présence, comme chaque année aussi nombreuse. C'est évidemment un soutien extrêmement important. Et je vous donne déjà rendez-vous l'année prochaine pour la prochaine conférence. On ne connaît pas encore exactement le nom de la conférencière ou du conférencier, mais ce sera tout aussi passionnant que cette année. Donc, dans une année de retour. Mais avant, je crois que l'Université de Genève a plein d'événements à faire valoir, notamment la semaine prochaine. Martine Collard, je crois qu'il y a un conseiller fédéral qui viendra nous entretenir d'une question extrêmement importante. On ne va pas ouvrir le débat ce soir sur les accords bilatéraux, sur les bilatérales 3. Donc, je vous donne rendez-vous la semaine prochaine. C'est mercredi soir, je crois, Martine. Mercredi soir, rendez-vous dans ce même auditoire. Très bonne soirée à tous et à tous et merci de votre présence.